when you read Genesis about Joseph, and you read
Daniel
help me
about
out here.
Daniel.
Daniel about Daniel?
Yeah, I was going to say Exodus, but Daniel about Daniel. Well, g'day, Brad. So good to be back. I feel really excited. I've just got to take a deep breath and slow down, because here we are back again for episode 1 of season 2 of the Sunday Monday podcast.
And we're going to dive into Esther, and I actually am really excited about this whole series we're going to do.
I've been blown away by Esther. I'm not preaching the first week, but I'm preaching a few of the messages, and what a piece of ancient history.
Absolutely. It's got all kinds of conspiracy, all kinds of crazy stuff in it.
And it's just written so matter-of-factly, like this happened, and then that happened, and then that happened, and anyway, we're going to get into all of that.
We'll dive into some gory details of it all, I'm sure, as we go.
Dani Bryant, so good to have you with us for episode 1.
Good to be back.
You preached at Redlands.
Yep.
And so good to have you on talking about that message.
Mm-hmm. Great to be here.
Dani, I know for this series, it's diving into narrative. So I know I probably have a similar experience to you, actually, that I've done a lot of preaching from books in the New Testament where you're talking theology and pastoral ideas and things like that. But preaching narratively is a whole different ballgame.
Definitely.
How have you found taking this grand picture or grand story of Esther? Like, what's the big thing you found out of it in your own study and research, getting ready for the message?
Great question. I think one of the most fascinating things about the Book of Esther is that God doesn't actually get mentioned by name at all.
This is the crazy thing about this book, right?
Mm-hmm. So God, you could look at it and just think that God is silent, that he's absent from the entire book because he isn't mentioned by name at all. In fact, there's not much religious, spiritual language used at all in 10 chapters. And I think one of the big takeaways that I've had, especially just focusing on chapters 1 and 2 for my message, is that God, even though it might appear that he is absent, he is not. He's at work. He's not silent, but he is at work amongst his people. And we see some really crazy things, or gory things, to use your language, happen in the first 2 chapters of Esther that I personally found incredibly confronting when I read them. But I found a lot of hope as well that, even despite the mess we see in the first 2 chapters, that God is at work, and we live in a world that's also messy, and we might not see exactly the same things happen today, but we live in a world that isn't neat and tidy, and yet even in seasons where we may feel like God is silent, we can have hope that he is at work.
I found it really mirrors a lot of what goes on today in some ways. Like in the book, there's probably going to say off the bat, if you haven't read first 2 chapters of Esther, pause the podcast right now, go read them.
Yes.
Like that's probably
Good
a
call, Brad.
really good part. And you probably if you're listening to this, you would have heard a message from somewhere across the Gateway ecosystem on Sunday. But in this story, as we get through, there's drinking, sex, murder, torture. There's big spikes. We'll get to them in weeks coming up with people impaled on. And there's people who are God's people who are going against God's laws to see God's work be done. So this is probably one of these big themes that comes through it.
Complicated.
It's so complex. How have you sat with the complexity of it? Like knowing that it's not an easy, clear cut, here's the golden story or the golden rule of this message or this book. How have you gone with sitting with the complexity of it?
I would say I was a kids pastor. I am familiar with the kids ministry Sunday school version of this story. And I think if you've paused it and you've read chapters 1 and 2, or you heard them on Sunday, you might have been quite confronted by the content that's included in those chapters. And that is definitely where I have found myself preparing and reading through this text. I think so much of what happens, especially in those first 2 chapters, is messy. And I think as I've kind of wrestled with that, I've found myself feeling a whole range of different emotions in those first 2 chapters. Like you kind of, as Sam said, it's kind of to the point, and the narrative, like it doesn't drag on. It just speaks to the story and what's happening. But I think I had moments of feeling anger, sadness, frustration, confusion, all wrapped into one within those chapters.
It's interesting. We use a term sometimes that I think is a massive untruth. We say a place, a city, or a home or whatever is God-forsaken. There's no such thing. What I love about, and even in these first 2 chapters, is there's some questions about the authorship of Esther. We don't really know who wrote it. It's a bit like Hebrews in that sense. That
Mm.
there's not a clear understanding, but there's no mention of God. The only mention that I can think of any religious activity is when Esther asks everyone to fast. That's coming later. But it's like it's a God-forsaken thing. All this stuff that happens is God-forsaken. People have forsaken God and they're just doing. It's like judges. They're just doing whatever seems right in their own eyes. And yet at the end, it launches this new Jewish festival. Like you can't get a more extreme.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it was you, Brad, or you, Dani, who said before, use the phrase clean and tidy. I know Dani pretty well. I know she's a clean and tidy sort of person.
Dani and I are cut from the same cloth.
Oh, there you go.
regard,
Okay.
so, yeah.
Well, I
Not
will.
fans of mess.
No.
I don't mind a bit of mess. Maybe I'll. Anyway, I'll stand alone on that. How did this challenge your way of how God works? Like it's clear in Esther that he's present in the mess, and he doesn't really clean it up.
Mm.
He never really cleans up the messes as you read through the story of Esther. But I don't know, as someone who likes the clean and tidy and likes everything to have a neat bow around it, and even as you're preaching it, to land it and have it everything sort of reconciled and whatever. How did that challenge you?
I think I had to sit in the mess of it. Like you, I think when we look at the weeks to come, there's some more great stuff that happens later on in Esther. But when you're just looking at chapters 1 and 2 and you're having to preach on those 2 chapters, there is the mess that you have to sit within. And as much as we joke about liking things neat and tidy, the reality is that's not the world that we live in. I have control over a couple of things. I can keep neat and tidy, my house, my office, that kind of thing. But I can't keep our world neat and tidy. And it is a place of mess, and it's a place where it can feel like God is silent or absent. But I think, like I've said, the hope in the first 2 chapters is that God is at work and that he is in control and that he is working in his people, even in the midst of the mess.
Yeah. And you said before, Dani, that you felt all that range of emotions. I know this reading these 2 chapters and then thinking, oh my goodness, how do I stand behind a pulpit and preach this stuff in a way that impacts people? There's a lot of emotion there. Can you talk to us about that and how you sort of navigated your way through that emotional battle?
Yeah, I would say again, the Sunday school version really easy to share, but we leave out a whole bunch of what happens. I think I found it really confronting reading about King Xerxes, the way that he kind of had his ego, I guess, popped with Queen Vashti not coming to his party. And then to see the events that came because he heard no, I found really confronting. I think as a female reading this story and reading it through the lens of how the women were treated, what Esther and those other women went through with, the fact that he was looking for the most beautiful, and then they went through 12 months of beauty treatments and each had to spend a night with the king. This is a really, really R-rated bad version of The Bachelor, and it is messed up.
Yeah.
And so I found reading that text confronting and going, this is in scripture and this is in the Bible. And as a female, putting myself in that story and going, man, the abuse of power, the ego, it is just so complex. The dynamics of power at play, the gender roles at play. Back then, it was confronting. I was reflecting of how there is still an abuse of power in 2024. There are still gender roles at play in some spaces. There are still dynamics of power that make me feel uncomfortable. And although the things that happened in Esther don't exactly to the letter happen today, those things are still prevalent because we still live in a broken, sin-filled world because we are, we're sinners.
Yeah.
And I reckon that's probably part of how the authors constructed this story in Esther, is that they have painted this picture that would be confronting to anyone who reads, listens, hears it.
Yeah.
And I think it was Timothy Keller's done a bit of work around Esther as well, which I've really enjoyed listening to some of his stuff. And he paints this picture of this story in Esther is dark and confronting, but even in those dark, confronting places, you can see the fingerprints of God on it.
Yeah.
that he hasn't forgotten or forsaken the people in those stories or the narratives, and doesn't forsake us now where we currently sit in today's world when we feel these feelings happening to us in the everyday. And thanks for sharing your experience too as a woman, Dani. I think that's really helpful for us to all see it different perspectives as well.
Yeah.
But in the midst of all of those spaces, God's fingerprints are on it. He literally holds it in his hand tenderly, but is also moving it for his good. And Timothy Keller points towards the Romans 8 verse. We know so well that he's working all things for good for those who are called according to his purposes. So I've just find that really interesting that, man, I can't see any hope in this story yet, but it's coming.
It's just God's a genius as well, gracious genius. Just the way that all this stuff's going on, stuff that like I said before is so godless. Like there's such a godlessness to what's happening, and on both sides, by the way. Like I think we're tempted to find who's the hero here, and I think the Old Testament I don't think it ever really paints a picture of the only hero we've got in Scripture is Jesus, right? If you want to give that label to who it deserves to go to. And the temptation is to hold Mordecai up or hold Esther up. And they are, like Esther, incredible woman, incredible leader, incredible boldness and bravery, even as she's a victim of Xerxes' abuse. But no one's innocent in all this. And there's so much twisted stuff going on, and still God who must look upon that like he did when he brought the flood, like he did when he looks at humanity and still says, no, I'm going to weave something out of this. And it's almost like, watch me work, watch me work, let me cook.
I love that.
That's a terrible irreverent phrase to put on God, but that's what the kids are saying these days. So we're just trying to appeal to our younger audience out there. If you're listening and you're a teenager, you're welcome. Anyway, I am pretty hip.
Yeah. Actually, you can take anything.
The fact that you use the word hip.
Oh, wow. See, I
means...
just undid it all.
You did.
This is a good note to move on to the next segment, I reckon.
Well, speaking of letting someone cook, we've actually got Tim K, who joined us in our bonus episode. Go back and listen to that if you haven't already. Tim's going to join us right now, and we're going to listen to that live. We haven't heard him speak this yet, so we're going to hear this the same time you're hearing it, and we'll unpack what he's got to say now. So, Tim, take it away.
Hey, guys. Great to be with you. As we look at Esther chapters 1 and 2 this week, there's so much going on in the background that it's hard to fit it all in. And really, you need to understand a lot about Persian culture and the Persian Empire to really get a feel for what's happening. There's also a lot of biblical allusions that are going on. Now, we talked about how in the Book of Esther, God is never mentioned. But one of the ways that we understand the theology of the Book of Esther is by the fact that the Book of Esther echoes previous books of the Old Testament. So you see that happen in culture today when someone will say a phrase and it's really clear that that phrase is alluding to something that everybody knows about. You might, in Australian culture, have someone say, that's not a knife. This is a knife, and everyone knows that that's alluding to the movie Crocodile Dundee. The same thing happens in the Bible when you've got books that are written later than earlier books. Those later books can allude to earlier books by referring back to them, by just using similar little phrases. And we see that happening in the Book of Esther a lot. It's one of the ways that the author of the Book of Esther hints at what he or she means when they're writing the book. So let's jump through a little bit in chapter 1. The first thing that you really need to notice is this characterization of King Xerxes. Now, for starters, some people call him Xerxes, some people call him Ahasuerus. Both are correct. Ahasuerus is an English version of the Hebrew word there that's in the Book of Esther, which is Achashverosh. But that is actually the Hebrew version of the Greek name Xerxes. So if you hear about King Xerxes, the Persian King Xerxes, that's the guy we're talking about in the Book of Esther. And he's characterized as being super rich and not very smart. So he's got this, he rules over 127 provinces. He's got this massive empire, and he throws these massive banquets where he shows off his wealth and gets drunk. And what that should do for us straight away is it should make us feel a sense of foreboding. It's like the music in the movie, which is kind of going da-na, 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 na-na, na-na. You're going, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? Because in the Bible, it's already told us earlier on that kings are not meant to accumulate wealth. That's in Deuteronomy 17. And it also says that kings aren't meant to get drunk. They're not meant to drink wine. That it says it in Proverbs 31. And so here we have a super wealthy, super drunk king. He's throwing a 180-day banquet, and he doesn't even know how to make decisions for himself. He's always just being swayed by other people's advice. And of course, this king isn't even a Jew. This is a foreign king ruling over Israel. So there's a lot going on that is foreboding in chapter 1. When we get to chapter 2, though, we meet Esther and Mordecai. And we obviously meet them in this weird time when King Xerxes has got a strategy to find a new queen for himself, and he throws this beauty pageant throughout the empire. Now, you also need to know that that was a foolish way of getting a new queen. In the Persian Empire, it was actually a very tolerant and diverse empire that had a huge amount of different people groups. And one way that a king could embrace the people groups in the empire was by political weddings, by having a political marriage. So if you think about it, King Xerxes might have been fully Persian, but if he married someone who was Egyptian, and then that would mean that his son, the next king, would be half Persian and half Egyptian, and that would make the empire work better because the Egyptian side of the empire would say, well, we don't mind being ruled by King Xerxes' son because he's one of us anyway. And that was a strategy that Xerxes' father Darius employed. And it was a wise political strategy at the time. Xerxes goes in the opposite direction, and he just wants the most beautiful woman to be his wife, and that would be seen as a foolish decision for a king. He's much more about pleasure than about stability in his empire. But we meet Esther, and she is this beautiful young Jewish woman. So what do we know about Esther? The first thing to notice is that she's in the Persian Empire, and she hasn't returned to the land of Israel. The story takes place after the exile and also after the return. So Cyrus was king of Persia before Xerxes, before his dad Darius, and he let the Jews go back and start rebuilding the temple back to the land of Israel. Esther and her family have not done that. And so really what we know about her family is that they're living in this diaspora. They're living in a foreign land, even though they could have gone back to their own land. And they're somewhat culturally embedded in that foreign land. Mordecai has a Babylonian name, and he sits at the king's gate, which means he was some kind of government official. And then we meet Esther, and what we see about Esther in chapter 2 is she finds favor and wins favor again and again throughout the chapter. And I think what I want to say is that's a key allusion to other biblical passages. So the other people in the Old Testament who kept finding favor and winning favor are Joseph and Daniel. Both of their stories are very similar to Esther's story. Both of them were taken. Both of them were subject to a foreign ruler, Joseph to the Pharaoh, Daniel to King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. And both of them found favor or won favor with the people who were ruling over the nation at that time. And of course, what we know from those stories is that there was a reason they kept finding favor with their rulers, and that was because God was with them. It says that so explicitly about Joseph and about Daniel. The fact that then Esther keeps finding and winning favor is a really clear indication from the author of the Book of Esther that Esther is finding and winning favor for the same reason as Joseph and Daniel, and that is that she is a godly person who is serving God with her life. So that's our Geek Out with the Greek segment of the Book of Esther, looking at chapters 1 and 2. Hope that was helpful.
Oh, that's been great from Tim to hear all of that. And he's talked about the geeking out in the Greek, but we need to figure out a name, whether it's hotting up on the Hebrew or
I'm
something
sure
else.
there is a better word
Any
out
other
there.
H word we can find.
Helping out with the Hebrew.
Helping out with the
Yeah,
Hebrew, yeah.
way
no.
better.
What gold from Tim, though. Man, that's
Incredible stuff.
incredible.
Yeah.
But he was saying actually when we were just meeting him around that fact that he's done master's level lecturing in this
Yeah.
space as well. Like, he's incredible. But the thing that really stood out to me, and maybe this is our something old, something new space, something that really was new, was about how he, the Esther's all about foreshadowing what has happened in some previous stories as well. So I think he mentioned Joseph and Daniel. Incredible thought that one, they also had different names.
Yeah.
Like, so what was Esther's name in this?
Hadassah.
Hadassah.
That was her Hebrew name, and Esther was her her Persian name.
Persian
Sorry.
name.
Yeah.
Daniel had that Belteshazzar. I'm not
Yep.
going to say that wrong for
That's-
sure. And I think Joseph, I had to Google this really quickly, was Zephanath, I think.
Yes. Yes.
So like this idea that she's joining the ranks of those two people who both brought people back from exile,
yeah.
or were involved with returning people to their land, that she joins those ranks, and it kind of foreshadows then if it's picking up what has happened, what is yet to happen with Jesus? That's probably
Yeah.
the question I want to leave dangling for us a bit.
Yeah.
Like, we will jump to end of this story in a few weeks' time, but the ending's not quite satisfying.
Yes.
It's this close but missed opportunity,
Yeah.
and it misses it. And I kind of think, what is Esther doing to foreshadow Jesus
Yeah.
thousands of years later, who will bring about a complete restoration to stories and fullness of hope rather than violence that still sits in this story? That's probably the
that's
thing that I'm
good.
excited about. That was really new for me.
I'm feeling a live challenge as you're listening to this podcast. That something I said before we listened to Tim, just to prove that we listen to him live, and we don't have time to think about it. I said before, Esther isn't super innocent in all this, but Tim made the point that connection and that I love, call that a knife. That was a good example.
Yeah.
But what the writer is really making super clear, even though not saying these words, is Esther is a godly woman and a godly character because of those connections that are clearly being drawn to Joseph and Daniel. So I take back what I said earlier. We won't go back and edit it out.
No, it's good.
But there is a godliness, there's a faith in Esther that is driving her forward, and in the face of some pretty horrendous treatment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Danny, what do you reckon around that idea of Persia being that tolerant society, but then this king is going completely the opposite way? Like, how do you see that sitting in the story? Like, what pictures does it paint for Esther for you?
One of the, as we speak to allusions and the links between the stories of Joseph and Daniel and then Esther, I really liked what Tim had to say about the fact that, that language around favor is used quite a lot in that second chapter. Esther found favor with Haggai. Esther found favor with the king. She found favor with the people that were in the harem, and that favor was something that Joseph and Daniel found as well. But in the text, in their stories, it also talks about how God was with them. And so even though that's not explicitly said in this second chapter of Esther, we can see God's fingerprints all over this story, and God was with Esther. He was with his people. And so I just love that picture, because I think so often we can find ourselves in situations and seasons where things are confusing, things are maybe messy, or it feels like we are like, where is God in all of this? And sometimes those things that might come across as luck or chance are actually God's providence, and
that's great.
that he is at work.
I love that, Dani, and it's got me thinking, hearing Tim talk about all that stuff and those allusions. Like when you read Genesis about Joseph, and you read
Daniel about Daniel.
Daniel about Daniel.
Yeah, I was going to say Exodus, but Daniel about Daniel. Yeah, that name escaped me. The writer of those books of the Bible are really clear, like what you've said. Like they're really clear. God spoke. God said this to Daniel. The angel came and visited Daniel. Joseph was able to interpret this dream because God spoke to him, and it's really, really clear. I'm fascinated under what circumstances the Book of Esther was written. Like I'm starting to wonder, was it written in this tolerant, diverse Persian culture that Tim talked about then, where they said, oh, yeah, you can tell your story, but just leave the religion out of it.
Yeah.
Doesn't that sound familiar?
Yeah.
Like 2024 in Australia.
Yeah, you live your truth, but just don't.
Just
inflict it on
leave
me.
God out of it. And, like I think of some of our school chaplains who can do love people, absolutely, all that sort of stuff. Just leave God out of it. We live in that climate right now where we're told, live that way and tell your stories, but just back off with the religious stuff. Which, again, after what you've just said, Dani, and what you said before, Brad, gives great hope to know that even though that's true, and Esther could be written in 2024, God is massively at work. Like he's not forsaken us. He's not just because we have the government that we have in this country, just because we have the laws that are being passed in this country, very recent laws as we record this podcast, all of the different stuff that's happening around employment and all that sort of stuff. You could look at it and go, God's left the building. No, he hasn't. He hasn't. This is not a God-forsaken country. God is not angry. God is not distant. He's not absent. He's not silent. He doesn't need his name to be mentioned in order to be powerfully at work.
Yeah.
He's that gracious genius that we talked about before.
Yeah. It's really good.
And I think the role that Esther played in that was showing up.
Yeah.
She showed up. Mordecai showed up. We read at the end of chapter 2. It kind of then heads into what we'll focus on next week. But Mordecai showed up at the gates. Like there's something for us as God's people that even in those situations, we are to show up.
They didn't withdraw, hey? Yeah, that's really good, Dani. They didn't go, well, let's just go and let's create the Jewish ghetto in Persia and let's just stay within ourselves. No, Mordecai was a government official, most likely, and Esther puts herself through pain, sensing that God is up to something.
Yeah.
And that's quite remarkable that they're very, and they even adopt Persian names. Even though they're Jewish, they adopt Persian names, that they adopt some of the Persian culture in order for God to be able to do something through them. That's quite remarkable.
Yeah. I reckon it raised a bunch of questions for us.
Yeah, it's true.
As we sit in this, maybe we begin to wrap up this episode of the podcast, thinking through where do we need to show up?
Yeah.
In places where it feels like it is God-forsaken or it feels like God isn't absent. How might he use us as an answer to the prayers we're praying in the places we go where it feels like we just need more of God here?
Yeah, that's good.
And I reckon that's probably the big challenge I see in Esther is that they kept saying yes. Mordecai, Esther kept saying yes, even in difficult circumstances, even yes to that freaky pageant thing that they did.
Yeah.
She said yes, and God used it. I wonder if God's trying to build up some of our Christian fortitude to keep saying yes and showing up in places where maybe we'll get persecuted. Maybe we'll get, well, persecuted is probably a strong word. Maybe we'll get ridiculed.
Yeah.
It's probably more apt. Where do we need to keep showing up?
Yeah.
Where we need to trust God that he's at work, even if we can't really see it.
Absolutely. Or even if we can't speak.
Yeah,
even if
right.
we're told to be. So I think that's a really good thing that you've said there, Brad, about working through this Sunday Monday podcast series around Esther. This is a narrative. This is not like Romans, where you can extract big, complete theological doctrines and all that sort of thing, but we're going to be working through week by week with more questions and answers sometimes as we get towards the end of the book.
And I think this question's actually good. We are probably thinking about trying to gather some questions you have too. So
Very good.
why don't you let us know what questions you might have? Pop it on any social pipes you've got or chat to your campus pass or whatever that looks like. Send us some questions, because we'd love to catch up with Tim again at the end of this series and maybe get him to ask some questions. I got a great question right now that's popped in my brain is, why on earth didn't Esther go back to Israel? Like, why do they want to stay in Persia? Like, maybe they had a good reason for it. We may not know the answer to that, but I'm curious that's piqued my curiosity. So what are your curious questions? Let us know. We would love to propose them to Tim at the end of this series.
I have a question. What on earth are social pipes?
Oh, like your socials. Like
Okay.
social.
I thought you just made that social pipes. That was good.
No, I've heard it somewhere before.
Have you?
And
Okay. No, nice one.
Yeah.
I've never heard it before.
rival podcast. Maybe
Something old, something new.
much bigger listener than ours. So
Dani, thanks so much for being on today.
Thanks for having me.
launching the series at Redlands.
Yeah, thank you.
And thanks, Brad.